The scent reached him before the words ever could honeysuckle, warm and unmistakable, clinging to his alpha's collar like a confession. Neither of them could take back. He didn't scream. He didn't beg for the truth. He simply watched the man he'd bonded to for 5 years stand there, guilty and unbothered, while another Omega's pregnancy hung in the air like a verdict already delivered. By morning, the marriage was ash, and the Omega who walked into the freezing dark was not the same one who'd cooked dinner that night. A stranger waited in that darkness, one who would end up claiming everything. What happened before sunrise? And why did it cost him everything he thought he knew about love? Stay till the end to find out and tell us in the comments who you are rooting for. Settle in and let us walk you through the story of Rowan Hale, the Omega, who walked out into a snowstorm with nothing but a duffel bag, and somehow still ended up claimed by someone far better than the one he left behind. If you've ever had to start completely over with nothing but the clothes on your back, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear how you found your footing again. They tell you a mating bond is sacred. Nobody tells you it's also a leash and that the person holding the other end can get bored of walking you. Nobody tells you, either, that the moment you finally drop that leash yourself, the person you become on the other side of it might be someone you actually like a great deal more than the one you used to be. When Marcus came home that night smelling of cedar and terrified honeysuckle, Rowan didn't need a confession. The scent clung to his husband's coat like a stain that would never lift, sweet, warm, unmistakably the scent of a pregnant Omega. Marcus didn't even have the decency to look guilty. He looked inconvenienced, the way a man looks when traffic makes him late for a meeting. That was the night Rowan's old life ended. By sunrise, a stranger would decide whether he lived through it. The apartment was too quiet. A sterile, pressurized silence broken only by the low electric hum of the refrigerator. Rowan stood at the kitchen island, palms flat against the cold quartz, and watched the microwave clock bleed red numbers into the dark 1:42 a.m. Dinner had gone cold hours ago, a roast chicken, seasoned exactly the way Marcus liked it, congealing in its own fat at the center of the table Rowan had set for two. He had lit the candles at 7. He had blown them out himself at 9, standing over the wax pooling into the tablecloth, telling himself it didn't mean anything that Marcus hadn't texted. Alphas at big firms worked late. That was simply a fact of the life Rowan had signed up for the day. He'd let a stranger's careful, patient courtship talk him into a mating bite in a candlelit restaurant 5 years ago. Both of them, 20-something, and certain the whole world was about to open up for them. He remembered believing it. He remembered, for at least the first 2 years. Being right, he didn't feel the urge to throw the dinner away now. He didn't feel much of anything except the dull, insistent burn at the base of his neck, where the raised scar of his mating mark sat like a brand no amount of turtlenecks had ever quite managed to hide. The mark had been aching all evening, a low simmer under the skin. Science had a clinical name for it, a sympathetic biological response. Omegas could feel it when their alphas were in distress, injured, or riding a spike of intense emotion. Rowan knew Marcus wasn't hurt. He knew exactly what that particular spike of adrenaline meant, because he'd felt smaller, dimmer versions of it for months. On the nights Marcus claimed he was stuck at the office, the lock turned, the door swung inward, catching on the entryway rug the way it always did. Marcus stepped through it a handsome man. An alpha built for boardrooms, with the kind of jaw that made strangers turn their heads on the street. Tonight, his shoulders were caved in, his tie hung loose, silk wrinkled, and his hair looked like he'd been dragging both hands through it for hours. He looked exhausted. He looked, Rowan thought distantly, pathetic. Rowan didn't move from the island. He watched Marcus kick off his shoes, the thud echoing through the cavernous, minimalist living room Marcus had insisted on leasing 3 years ago, all glass and steel. A museum nobody was allowed to actually live in. Then the air shifted. Alpha's scents were built to fill a room, to claim territory, to soothe or to dominate depending on what the moment called for. Marcus's baseline scent was cedar and cracked black pepper. Tonight, the pepper was gone entirely, replaced by the sour, metallic tang of panic. That wasn't what made Rowan's stomach drop. Underneath the panic soaked into Marcus's collar, his hair, the very fibers of his coat was the thick, cloying sweetness of honeysuckle, rich, heavy, threaded with a buttery undertone that every alpha and omega on earth was wired to recognize on instinct. Fertility, conception, new life, taking root in someone else's body. Marcus finally lifted his eyes and found Rowan across the dim room. He froze. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Rowan, don't. Rowan's voice came out flat, stripped of every inflection he owned. It didn't sound like his. Don't say a single word until I ask you something. And when I ask, you're going to answer with a yes or a no, nothing else. Marcus flinched like he'd been struck. His instinct to soothe a distressed mate was warring visibly with his own guilt. And the collision produced a nauseating cocktail of pheromones that made the air taste like ash. Rowan, please, you have to let me explain. Yes or no? Rowan pushed off the counter and walked slowly around the island, bare feet silent on the hardwood. He stopped 10 feet away from the man he had been bonded to for 5 years. The honeysuckle was suffocating now, clawing at the back of his throat. Is he pregnant? The silence stretched. Somewhere down on the street, a car passed, its headlights dragging a pale arc across the ceiling. Marcus's eyes dropped to the floor. Yes. Rowan nodded slowly. The floor didn't open up and swallow him. The world didn't end. It was just a quiet, brutal confirmation of a rot he'd felt spreading through their foundation for the better part of a year. Who? It wasn't a question anymore. It was a demand. His name is Julian. Marcus's voice had gone hoarse, cornered. He's a temp from the office. It was a mistake. Rowan, I swear to God, it was a rut spike. We were working late. His suppressants failed, and my biology just, I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I love you. A rut spike. Rowan let the word sit on his tongue like something rotten. A rut spike lasts 3 days. Marcus. It doesn't happen on a random Tuesday over a spreadsheet review. You've been sleeping with him for months. I've smelled sugar on your collar since spring. Don't insult me by blaming your own hormones. He's 21. Rowan. Marcus took a step forward, hands lifting in that pleading gesture Rowan used to find endearing. Now it just looked like theater. He's a kid? He didn't know what he was doing, and now he's terrified, and he's carrying my pup. You know how badly we wanted this? You know how hard we tried? There it was, the knife between the ribs, twisted exactly where it would do the most damage. Rowan's hand went, unbidden, to his own flat stomach. 5 years, 3 miscarriages, a small fortune spent on fertility specialists, hormone injections, ultrasounds that showed nothing where something should have been. Society had spent Rowan's whole life telling him that an Omega's highest calling was to give his alpha children. When Rowan couldn't, he'd watched, in real time, as disappointment ate through the affection Marcus used to wear so openly. The romantic alpha who'd once promised him the world had slowly turned into a man who looked at his own husband like a broken appliance he was too polite to throw out. Rowan thought, distantly, of the nursery. They'd never furnished the room at the end of the hall that had stayed a home office for 5 straight years because neither of them could bear to paint it and then have to unpaint it again. He thought of the specialist office with its watercolor prints of storks, of Marcus's hand going slack in his during the third loss, already thinking about something else. So you outsourced? Rowan said softly. That's not fair. Marcus dragged a shaking hand down his face. I'm not leaving you. I'll set Julian up in an apartment somewhere, cover everything he needs, be involved with the baby on weekends. Nothing has to change between us. You're my mate, Rowan. You wear my mark. Rowan laughed, a short, hollow sound that scraped his throat raw on the way out. You think I'm going to sit in this glass museum playing the Baron, understanding husband, while you go visit your new Omega and your new baby whenever it's convenient for you? It's a compromise. Omegas stay with their alphas, that's how this works. Not this Omega. Rowan turned his back on him and walked past the ruined dinner, down the hall, into the bedroom they'd shared for half a decade. He dragged his old canvas duffel out from the back of the closet. He didn't pack the cashmere Marcus had bought him, or the watches, or the tailored suits that had never once felt like his own clothes. He packed his flannels, his broken-in jeans, socks, underwear, his winter boots. Marcus appeared in the doorway, panic curdling into something sharper. His cedar scent had gone jagged, aggressive. You can't leave. The bond won't let you. You'll go into shock. Rowan, you're bonded to me. The bond's already rotting. Rowan zipped the duffel with a hard, final rip. You bonded to him the second you put a child in him. Biology runs both ways. Marcus, I've felt you pulling away for months. Tonight just made it official. He walked toward the door. Marcus blocked it, chest heaving, every alpha instinct in his body screaming at him to trap what was his, to keep it from walking out into the night. Rowan didn't flinch. He looked up into eyes he used to love and found nothing behind his own gaze but a flat, cold winter Move, he said quietly, or I call the police and tell them my alpha is holding me against my will in our own home. Think about what that does to your name at the firm. Marcus hesitated. The threat to his career cut through the biological haze faster than anything else could have. He stepped aside. Rowan walked out of the bedroom, down the hall, and out the front door without looking back. It clicked shut behind him, sealing off the life he'd built and the man he'd built it with. The street was a different world at 2 in the morning, stripped of its daytime polish, all flickering neon and wet pavement holding the ghost of an earlier rain. The wind off the river cut straight through Rowan's jacket as he walked. No destination in mind. Boots hitting concrete in a steady, mechanical rhythm. 5 blocks. 10. He just needed distance between himself and the smell of honeysuckle rot. But distance didn't touch biology. By the 15th block, the first wave hit. It started as a tremor in his hands. He tightened his grip on the duffel strap, but the shaking climbed up his arms and settled somewhere deep in his chest. A mating bond, when healthy, was a warm hum of belonging running under everything background noise, so constant you forgot it was there. Severed abruptly, without the clinical intervention of bond-suppressant drugs. It felt like someone dragging a rusted hook through his nervous system 1 raw inch at a time. Rowan stumbled, his shoulder clipping a brick wall. He leaned into it, gasping. The air felt thin. The scar over his scent gland burned like a lit match pressed flat against the skin. His body was realizing, cell by cell, that its alpha was gone, and worse, that its alpha belonged to somebody else now. Millennia of hardwired omega biology, built for submission and pack survival, was tipping into full systemic panic. Breathe. He told himself, you are not an animal. You are a person. You can survive a chemical reaction. He pushed off the wall. The streetlights smeared into long yellow ribbons. His own scent, usually a mild black tea and bergamot, was spiking wildly out of his control, curdling into something like burnt sugar and rotting leaves, the unmistakable stink of an omega in crisis. Any alpha within half a mile could smell that. A distressed, unbonded omega alone on the street at 2 a.m. was a target, plain and simple. He needed shelter, not a hotel. He didn't have the deposit, and Marcus watched every card somewhere bright, public, and utterly indifferent to who walked in. 2 blocks later, he found it a 24-hour diner tucked under the rusted elevated tracks, its neon sign buzzing, one letter flickering in and out like a bad heartbeat. Rowan shoved through the glass door. The bell jingled, bright and absurd against the wreck he felt like inside. Stale coffee, burnt bacon grease, industrial bleach, a beautiful, ugly wall of smell that swallowed the burnt sugar panic leaking off his skin. The place was nearly empty. 2 truckers hunched over eggs by the window, a man asleep at the far end of the counter. Rowan folded himself into a booth at the back, wedged the duffel between his knees, and kept his coat zipped to the throat even though he was shaking. A waitress appeared. Her name, Tag Reed Gale, tired eyes, gray roots, and the calm, neutral scent of a beta completely unmoved by whatever pheromone storm was happening 3 feet away from her. Coffee. Black. Rowan managed through chattering teeth. And water, please. Gale gave him a long, assessing look. The tremor, the pallor, the blown pupils. She didn't ask a single question. Working the graveyard shift in this city, she'd seen worse walk through that door. I'll bring the pot. She set a heavy mug down and poured, then slid a small basket of crackers across the table. Eat those. Your blood sugar's crashing. You look like you're about to meet your maker, sweetheart. Thank you, Rowan whispered, wrapping both shaking hands around the mug. The heat anchored him just enough to stay upright while his nervous system tore quietly apart underneath. He caught his reflection in the dark window glass hollowed out, a ghost wearing his own face. This was the part the romance movies never showed. They loved the biting, the claiming, the euphoric rush of 2 people binding together forever. Nobody filmed the part where one of them decided to leave, and the other one had to survive the withdrawal alone in a diner booth at 3 in the morning. He tore open a packet of crackers with trembling fingers and forced himself to chew, swallowing past the lump of grief lodged in his throat. He would not wither. He would survive tonight, and tomorrow, and the one after that. Somewhere behind the counter, a radio murmured low through a weather report nobody was listening to, and the rhythm of it mundane, indifferent, entirely unconcerned with the fact that Rowan's whole life had just come apart was oddly steadying. The world kept turning whether or not his bond survived the night. There was a strange, thin comfort in that. Time blurred. The fever rose and dipped. The diner emptied. then slowly filled again as the city shifted from the dead of night into the bruised purple of early dawn. The bell over the door jingled again, sharper this time, cutting through the low murmur of early risers. Rowan forced his eyes open. The crowd had changed shifts along with the sky, the night walkers gone, replaced by transit workers and construction crews. People who worked with their hands and smelled like it. His body felt like it had been run through a wringer. The tremors had settled into a deep, full body ache. The fever had broken, leaving him cold and clammy inside his own clothes. The bond wasn't severed yet, that would take weeks, maybe longer, but the worst of the initial shock had passed. How was in the hollow after? The bell jingled once more. A man walked in, and Alpha Rowan's battered instincts flared, but not with the panic he expected, with something closer to caution. The man was tall, broad through the shoulders, but he didn't carry himself with the chest-out swagger Marcus and every one of his corporate friends wore like cologne. He moved quietly, taking up space without demanding it. Faded jeans, a gray thermal shirt, a canvas jacket lined with fleece, scuffed work boots, stained dark with something Rowan didn't want to guess at. As he passed Rowan's booth on his way to the counter, his scent drifted over not manufactured, not city slick, motor oil, old leather, wood smoke, and underneath it all, a faint, steady thread of pine, calm, grounded, like an anchor dropped in rough water. Gail poured him a coffee without being asked. Morning, Silas. Morning, Gail. His voice was low and gravelly, pleasant in a way that had nothing to do with charm and everything to do with weight. Silas? Rowan tested the name silently. It fit the man sturdy, uncomplicated, no polish wasted on it. Rowan reached for his own mug and his hand spasmed, ceramic clattering against the saucer, spilling coffee across the table. He swore under his breath, grabbing napkins, and the sudden movement sent his head spinning. The nausea that had gone quiet for the last hour reared back up with a vengeance. He doubled over, pressing his face into his hands, trying to breathe through it, and felt his scent spike again, sharp, sour, burnt sugar cutting straight through the bacon grease. A shadow fell across the table. Rowan looked up, one hand flying automatically to guard his throat. Silas was standing beside the booth. Up close, he was older than Rowan had first guessed, early 40s. Maybe, with a short, gray-flecked beard and lines carved deep around a pair of pale hazel eyes that missed nothing. He didn't loom. He didn't push his scent outward the way alphas did when they wanted an omega's spine to bend. He just stood there, one hand around his coffee, the other holding a fresh glass of ice water he set down on the dry half of Rowan's table. "You're in bond shock," he said. Not a question, a fact, delivered without pity. Rowan tried to summon a glare. "I'm fine. Mind your own business." Silas ignored that entirely and slid into the booth across from him. Uninvited, hands flat on the table. The proximity should have terrified Rowan and unbonded. Crashing Omega trapped across from a strange alpha, but Silas's scent was deliberately reined in, folded tight around himself so it wouldn't crash into Rowan's already frayed system. "You're shaking the table, kid. Pupils are blown. You're sweating through your coat, and you smell like a forest fire broke out in a candy shop. You're maybe an hour from your whole nervous system shutting down. You a doctor? Mechanic?" Silas said it flatly. "But I know what it sounds like when an engine's about to throw a rod. Yours is tearing itself apart." Rowan wanted to tell him to go to hell, to grab his bag and walk. His body had other plans. A shudder racked his frame hard enough to click his teeth together, and he slumped forward, the fight draining out of him, leaving nothing but the pathetic truth underneath it. "He left," Rowan whispered, and hated himself the second the words were out. "No, I left. He got a 21-year-old pregnant. I walked out." Silas didn't look shocked. He didn't offer some hollow platitude. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Cowardly thing, letting your Omega walk out into the cold mid-severance. I told you, I left him. Doesn't matter who walked first. He should have had someone call you a medic, put you somewhere to ride the fever out safe." He set his mug down and reached across the table. Rowan flinched back against the vinyl. Silas stopped instantly, hand opened, resting flat and empty in the middle of the table. A gesture, not a demand. "I'm not going to touch you without you saying it's fine, but you can't stay in this booth. Gail's a good sort, but she's got a breakfast rush coming and she doesn't need you seizing up in it." "I don't have anywhere to go," Rowan admitted, the last of his armor cracking clean through. "I don't have cash for a room." Silas studied him for a long moment. The diner buzzed on around them, oblivious to the quiet, strange gravity settling over the booth. I live 4 blocks from here, he said finally. Spare room on the first floor, lock on the inside of the door. You can crash there and sleep the fever off. No strings. Why would you do that? Because it's 28 degrees outside and I don't like watching people freeze, Silas said. Plain as weather. And because my sister went through a bad severance 10 years back and nobody helped her. I told myself if I ever saw someone in that state, I wouldn't walk past. It was a gamble, a big one. But Rowan looked into those tired hazel eyes and found nothing predatory in them. No hidden agenda. Just a man holding out a rope to somebody drowning. Slowly, hand trembling, Rowan reached across the table, not to take Silas's hand, but to touch the sleeve of his jacket. Okay, he whispered. Silas nodded once, no smile, and stood, dropping a 5 on the table for the coffee before reaching under the booth to sling Rowan's duffel over his own shoulder like it weighed nothing. Come on, let's get you off the street. The walk to Silas's house was a blur of biting wind and gray concrete. Rowan's body was shutting down piece by piece, the adrenaline that had carried him this far entirely spent. His knees buckled twice on the icy sidewalk, and both times Silas was simply there, no fuss, no possessive arm, no flood of dominant pheromones, just a calloused hand hooked under his elbow, hauling him upright with the easy strength of a man used to lifting engine blocks. 3 more blocks. Silas grunted, breath pluming white. He walked on the outside of the sidewalk, his broad frame breaking the worst of the wind coming off the river. It was such a small, practical thing. Marcus had always walked a half step ahead, expecting the world to part for him and Rowan to keep pace. Silas matched Rowan's stumbling gait without comment. They turned onto a quiet street lined with old craftsman houses the city's renovation money hadn't reached yet. Cars sat on frozen lawns. The streetlights buzzed with faulty wiring. Silas led him up a cracked walkway to a dark blue house with peeling paint and a wide, sagging porch, unlocked the door, and stepped aside to let Rowan go first. The house smelled like old timber, wood smoke, and dog, nothing like the sterile glass box Marcus had loved. This place was worn in creaking floorboards. A pair of enormous work boots kicked haphazardly onto a rubber mat by the door. Down the hall, Silas said, setting the duffel on the floor. Last door on the left, bathrooms across from it, towels in the cabinet. Rowan nodded and shuffled down the narrow, dim hallway, pushed open the door to a sparse guest room oak bed frame, a heavy quilt, a battered dresser, a small window overlooking an overgrown yard. It was, he thought distantly, the most beautiful room he'd ever seen. Heavy footsteps followed. Silas stopped in the doorway with a glass of water and 2 white pills. Ibuprofen, he said, setting them on the nightstand. Won't stop the severance, but it'll take the edge off the fever. Drink the whole glass. You're dehydrated. Rowan stared at the pills, then up at him, his cynical mind scanning for the catch. An alpha didn't take in a crashing stray omega for nothing. What do you want? Silas's hazel eyes were entirely without heat. I want you to sleep so I can go to work without wondering if I'll come home to a body. Lock the door, kid. He stepped back and pulled it shut. Rowan stood frozen for a long moment, then reached out with a shaking hand and twisted the brass lock. Click. A small, absolute, mechanical wall between him and the rest of the world. He collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, boots and all, curling into a tight knot on top of the quilt. The moment his body hit the mattress, the fever came surging back like a rogue wave. The next 3 days were a descent through biological hell. A severance was a violent eviction. His nervous system, wired for months to Marcus's steady dominant signal, was in full panic over the sudden void. Rowan sweated through his clothes. He shivered until his teeth ached. He dry heaved into a trash can he dragged next to the bed. He wept ugly. Exhausted tears mourning not just the alpha who'd betrayed him, but 5 years of his own life, flushed away on broken promises. He hallucinated the smell of honeysuckle so vividly it made him claw at his own throat. But every time the panic threatened to tip into something dangerous, a different scent slipped in under the door pine, oil, old leather, faint and deliberately muffled, but steady, a rhythmic pulse moving through the house. He heard heavy footsteps pass his door, the low murmur of a radio in the kitchen. Once, deep in the night, he woke to find a fresh pitcher of water and clean towels waiting just outside his door. On the second night, in the worst of it, he thought he heard the floorboard stop right outside his room and stay there, not moving on, not knocking, just standing, close enough that Rowan could hear the faint creak of weight shifting from one boot to the other. He never called out. He never asked if anyone was there. But some small, battered part of his nervous system registered the presence anyway. And the fever eased, just slightly, just long enough for him to fall into something closer to real sleep than he'd managed in 2 days. Silas never knocked. He never intruded. He simply anchored the house, a gravitational pull that kept Rowan from spinning off into the dark completely. Biology was a trap, but for 3 days. That locked door was a sanctuary. Rowan woke to the sound of rain against the window. He lay still, bracing for the crushing pull of the bond, the phantom ache. It didn't come. The tear in his nervous system hadn't healed. That would take months, but the active bleeding had stopped. The fever had broken. He felt hollowed out, brittle, but unmistakably alive. He showered under scalding water for 20 minutes, scrubbing his skin raw with a bar of cheap soap, trying to wash off the honeysuckle, the sterile smell of fertility clinics, every ghost Marcus had left on him. When he finally looked in the mirror, he was pale, hollow-cheeked, dark bruises under his eyes. The mating mark on his neck was an angry, inflamed crescent, but the hunted, frantic look was gone from behind his eyes. He walked to the kitchen. It smelled of bacon and coffee, deeply domestic, and his shrunken stomach cramped with sudden hunger. Silas sat at a scarred wooden table wearing a grease-stained shirt, reading glasses low on his broken nose, meticulously disassembling a carburetor. At his feet lay an enormous, block-headed dog, something that looked like a pit bull crossed with a cinder block. Brindle coat, heavily scarred. The dog's head snapped up and it let out a low growl. Rowan froze. Silas didn't even glance up. Quiet, Tank, he's fine. The dog huffed, dropped its head back onto its paws, and closed its eyes. Eggs in the pan, toast in the rack, eat. Rowan didn't argue. His legs were unsteady, but his body was already forgiving him, absorbing calories greedily once he started. They ate in silence for 10 minutes. Nothing but the scrape of a fork, rain on the roof, the metallic clink of tools. I owe you, Rowan said finally, pushing his empty plate away, his voice raspy from disuse. You don't owe me anything. Silas set the carburetor down and wiped his hands on a rag, taking off his glasses to look at Rowan directly. You survived the crash. Most Omegas don't manage that without a clinic pumping them full of sedatives. I didn't have much of a choice. There's always a choice. You chose to walk. He leaned back, the chair creaking under him. You look like hell, but your sense leveled out. No more burnt sugar, just black tea. Rowan's hand went instinctively to cover his throat, an old protective reflex against alphas cataloging his pheromones. Silas shook his head. Don't. I'm not tracking you. I'm telling you, you're not a walking distress flare anymore. Nobody on the street will look at you twice. You're safe to leave, if that's what you want. The offer just sat there. The front door was right there. Rowan had his bag. He'd survived the worst of the physical withdrawal. He could walk out into the rain and start piecing together whatever was left of his life. But looking at the quiet, grease-stained man across the table, Rowan felt something steady itself in his chest for the first time in days. Marcus's world had been a chessboard, and Rowan had been a trophy first. Then, eventually, a defective incubator waiting to be swapped out. This kitchen, with its scarred dog and ticking clock, felt real in a way he hadn't touched in years. There's nowhere else for me to go, Rowan admitted, the hardest sentence he'd said all week. My name's not on the lease. My accounts are tied to his. I've got $34 in my wallet. Silas didn't look pitying. He looked entirely unsurprised. Standard playbook. Isolate the mate, control the money. Makes it harder to run when the alpha starts acting like a stray dog. I'm not a charity case. Rowan's chin lifted defensively. I'll get a job. I'll pay rent for the room. Just give me a week to sort it out. Silas took a slow sip of his coffee, looked at Rowan, then down at the dog, then back. $100 a week. You cook your own food. You clean up after yourself. You don't touch my tools. Deal. Relief, sharp and sudden, flooded through Rowan's chest. Deal. The illusion of a clean break lasted exactly 4 days. Rowan spent them scrubbing the house partly to earn his keep, partly out of a manic need to stay moving. He organized the pantry, cleaned baseboards, even got Tank to accept a tentative scratch behind the ears without a growl. The physical labor kept his mind off the dead silence in his chest where the bond used to hum. He'd left his phone dead in his duffel since the night he walked out. He knew exactly what was waiting behind that black screen. But on the fourth afternoon, with Silas at the shop, Reality demanded attention. He needed a job. He needed to check his email. He plugged the sleek phone in at the kitchen table. The screen lit, and a second later it began vibrating violently, sliding across the wood grain bing, 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 bing like a slot machine hitting jackpot after jackpot. Notifications flooded the screen. 80 something missed calls, over 100 texts, voicemail stacking up, all from Marcus. Rowan's chest seized. He scrolled through the time-stamped wreckage of Marcus's unraveling. Tuesday, 2:45 a.m. Rowan, where the hell are you? Come home. This isn't funny. Tuesday, 4:10 a.m. The bond's burning. Are you okay? Please pick up. Tuesday, 8:00 a.m. I drove around the whole city looking for you. You're acting like a child. We need to talk about Julian. Wednesday, 11:30 a.m. My lawyer says if you don't come back to the house, it counts as abandonment. Don't do this. Wednesday, 900 p.m. I miss you. Please. The apartment's empty. Julian's crying because his hormones are a mess and I just want my mate. Bile rose in Rowan's throat at the sheer, breathtaking selfishness of it. Marcus complaining to him about the pregnant Omega he cheated with. The phone buzzed again. An incoming call. Marcus. Rowan froze, thumb hovering over the red button, muscles locked by 5 years of conditioning, of jumping the instant his alpha called. The phone kept buzzing, vibrating up his arm. The front door opened. Rowan jumped, nearly dropping it. Silas walked in, wiping grease from his hands. Took one look at Rowan, pale, shaking, staring at the ringing phone like it might bite, and understood immediately. His whole posture changed, the easy slouch replaced by something dense and still. That him? Rowan nodded, unable to speak. The phone kept ringing. Silas didn't ask permission this time. He crossed to the table, picked it up, and answered. Rowan. Marcus's voice spilled out of the speaker, frantic and breathless. Oh, thank God. Where are you? I've been out of my mind. Come home right now. The bond. Rowan can't come to the phone, Silas said, flat. No anger in it at all, the voice of a man reading off the weather. Dead silence. Then a sharp, aggressive breath. Who the hell is this? Marcus's voice spiked with the alpha frequency he used to force submission through walls. Where is my Omega? He's not your Omega, Silas replied, unhurried. He's sitting at my table, and he's not coming back to your house. Put him on the phone. Now. I am his alpha, Marcus roared. I'll have police at your door in 10 minutes. Were, Silas corrected mildly. You were his alpha. You broke the contract the day you bred outside your pack. The bond's dead. He survived the crash. He's clear of you. I know where he is, Marcus hissed, his voice sliding into a low, unsettling calm. I've got his phone tracked. I know the address. I'm coming to get what's mine. Silas looked at Rowan, who was gripping the table's edge white-knuckled, eyes wide with genuine terror. He looked back at the phone. He didn't raise his voice, didn't try to out-alpha Marcus with volume. You want to know something funny? City boy, Silas said, before the threat proper. He's been sitting in my kitchen for 4 days. Ate off my plates. Fed my dog scraps when he thought I wasn't looking. Never once mentioned your name until it rang. That's not a man who's still bonded to you. That's a man who's already moved on and just hadn't gotten around to telling you yet. Listen carefully. City boy, he continued, dropping into a slow, gravel-bottomed rumble. This house is my territory. You step on my porch, cross my threshold. I'm not calling the cops. I'll break both your legs with a tire iron and put you in the river. Don't call this number again. He pulled the phone from his ear, tapped it off, and calmly dropped it into the half-full glass of water on the table. The screen flickered, sparked once, and died, sinking to the bottom in a stream of tiny bubbles. Rowan stared at it. The panic that had been strangling him seconds ago evaporated, replaced by a shocking rush of adrenaline. He said he has the address, Rowan whispered. Let him come. Silas was already at the fridge, cracking a beer with a lighter. He took a long pull, eyes steady. Porch floorboards need replacing anyway. Might as well have somebody to bleed on them. For the first time in a week, a real, cracked smile broke across Rowan's face. The crunch of tires on frozen gravel tore through the quiet. 20 minutes later, Rowan didn't need to look out the window. His stomach seized on pure muscle memory. Obedience and fear tangled up together. The low, expensive growl of a German engine idling in the driveway was unmistakable. Marcus had found them. Silas didn't rush. He took one more slow swallow of beer, set the bottle on the counter, and walked to the front door with the unhurried certainty of a glacier. No weapon, no chest puffing. Stay here, he said. No, Rowan stood, knees shaking but voice steady. He's my problem. Silas paused at the door, looked him over, pale skinned, white-knuckled grip on the doorframe, and gave one short nod. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Rowan followed, standing just behind his shoulder. A black sedan sat parked diagonally across the cracked driveway. Headlights blinding in the fading light, Marcus stepped out of the driver's seat, looking wrecked, overcoat unbuttoned, tie missing, stubble dark along his jaw. But it was his scent that hit Rowan first, cedar gone chaotic, masked under panic, and underneath it all, still, the heavy sweetness of honeysuckle. Marcus slammed the car door and marched up the walkway, eyes locked on Rowan. Get your things. He didn't so much as glance at Silas. He didn't register the massive, scarred dog now standing at the top of the porch steps, hackles raised in a straight line down its spine. We're going home. He pushed his pheromones forward, a physical weight in the air. The biological command meant to make an Omega drop his gaze and bare his throat. Rowan felt it press against his skin, heavy and suffocating, and then he felt it slide off, useless. The neurological tether that used to force his body to comply simply wasn't there anymore, burned away by the fever. Marcus was just a man shouting on somebody else's lawn. I'm not going anywhere, Rowan said, voice carrying clear and flat across the cold yard. Marcus stopped at the bottom of the stairs, the dismissal short-circuiting something behind his eyes. He looked at Silas instead. Tell him to get in the car. You've had your fun playing hero. The bond's active. He belongs to me. Bond looks pretty dead from where I'm standing, Silas drawled, leaning against the porch post, arms crossed. And you're trespassing. He's my husband, Marcus shouted, composure cracking. He took a step up. Tank barked once, a sound like a gunshot. Marcus froze. I haven't filed the divorce papers yet, Rowan said, stepping around Silas to the top of the stairs, looking down at the man who had been the center of his whole universe for 5 years, looking at the wrinkled coat, the desperate eyes, the aggressive posturing. He felt nothing but a deep, exhausted pity. But I will tomorrow. You wanted a family. Marcus, you've got one now. Go be a father to Julian's baby. Julian is a disaster. Marcus's voice cracked, the ugly truth spilling out in a rush of selfish desperation. He cries constantly. He doesn't know how to run a house, doesn't know how to host, doesn't know how to do anything. I can't live like this. I need you. You know how I like things. We could raise the pup together. You could try loving him instead, Rowan said. That's usually how people manage it. That's not the same as running a household, Rowan, and you know it. Julian panics if the dry cleaning's late. You never panicked about anything. You just handled it. That's what I need. The audacity of it hung in the freezing air. He didn't want Rowan back out of love. He wanted Rowan back because Rowan had been an efficient manager of his life. The quiet, incompetent Omega who handled the dry cleaning and the dinners and smiled at corporate parties while Marcus kept his shiny new toy on the side. You don't want a mate, Rowan said softly, the last ghost of old affection finally burning out. You want a maid? I'm not doing it. Rowan, please. I don't love you anymore. The words fell between them like stones. Unshouted, absolute. The bond broke the night you came home smelling like him. You killed it. Not me. Marcus stared at him, the command in his scent fracturing into pure panic. He took another step forward, hand reaching. You can't just throw away 5 years. Silas moved. Not a run, just one heavy boot planted on the next step down, placing himself squarely between Marcus and Rowan. He's done, Silas said, and his voice had lost every trace of its rumble, gone cold and flat as iron. The restrained scent of pine and motor oil suddenly uncoiled like a whip, older, deeper, promising violence rather than demanding submission. Get in your car, put it in reverse. Ask me twice and I'll take your jaw off. Marcus looked at the mechanic, at the dog, finally, at Rowan, searching for one last flicker of the obedience he'd built a marriage on. Rowan just watched him, face an impassive mask. The fight drained visibly out of the man on the lawn. He lowered his hand, turned, and walked back to his car, shoulders slumped, and didn't look back as he reversed hard enough to leave black tire marks across the asphalt. Silence rushed back in, broken only by wind through dead leaves. Rowan stood on the porch a long time, staring at the empty driveway, his chest strangely light, 5 years of low-grade anxiety had just driven off in a German sedan. Beside him, Tank finally sat down, tail thumping once against the porch boards as though the entire confrontation had been mildly interesting, but ultimately beneath his concern. Rowan let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since Tuesday, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 5 straight years loosened by one single, undeniable degree. Silas didn't make a speech. He whistled for the dog. "Beer's getting warm," he said, turning back toward the door. Rowan breathed in the freezing air. It tasted clean. He followed Silas back inside, the door clicking shut behind him on the whole of his past. Winter bled into a cold, wet spring. Snow melted into gray slush. The days stretched marginally longer, and the rhythm of the house on Birch Street settled into something steady, almost metronomic. Rowan didn't leave after the first week. He didn't leave after the first month. He found part-time work at a hardware store 2 streets over, keeping inventory and doing the books for an elderly beta owner who paid him under the table while his divorce ground slowly through the courts. It wasn't glamorous. The pay was a fraction of what Marcus used to deposit without a second thought. But every Friday, Rowan slid a crisp $50 bill under the salt shaker on the kitchen table. The first time he did it, Silas stared at the bill for a long moment, then folded it into his wallet and said, "Thanks." That single word laid the foundation for everything that came after: respect, equality, and unspoken contract neither of them had bothered to write down. Their life together became an intricate dance of boundaries. Omega-verse biology demanded hierarchy by default. Alphas led. Omegas followed, but Silas simply refused to play the game. He never used an alpha's voice on Rowan. He never flooded a room with his scent to prove a point. When Rowan was in the kitchen, Silas gave him the space. When Rowan read on the couch, Silas took the armchair across the room. At first, it drove Rowan's frayed instincts half mad, his body hypervigilant, braced for the other shoe or for Silas to eventually demand some biological toll for his protection. The toll never came. Trust built instead, in microscopic increments. It built the morning Rowan started making 2 cups of coffee instead of one, leaving a black mug on the counter for Silas before his shift. It built the day Silas noticed the soles of Rowan's boots were wearing thin and, without a word, left a brand new pair of steel-toed work boots by the door exactly his size. It built, too, on a quiet night in March when Rowan finally told him about the fertility clinic, the storks on the waiting room wallpaper, the 3 losses spaced out over 5 years like punctuation marks in a sentence that never got to finish. He told it flatly, expecting the conversation to end the way it always had with Marcus, a subject to be managed, redirected, quietly resented. Silas just listened, working a rag over a wrench he didn't need to clean anymore. And when Rowan finally ran out of words, all he said was, "That's not a failure. That's just what happened to you. Those are different things." It wasn't much, but it was the first time anyone had drawn that particular line for him. And something in Rowan's chest unclenched that he hadn't realized was still holding its breath. Not every day was easy. 6 weeks into the job, a customer came in looking for deck screws and left a wake of cologne behind him at the register, the same brand Marcus had worn for years. Sharp and citrus heavy under something woodier. Rowan's hands went cold around the register drawer. His vision tunneled. For a moment, he wasn't standing behind a counter in a hardware store at all. He was back in that glass apartment, watching a man he used to love walk in, smelling like someone else's fertility. He didn't remember calling anyone. He remembered, later, standing in the stockroom with his back against a shelf of paint cans, breathing in ragged, useless gulps, and the store's elderly owner hovering nearby with a look of gentle alarm, saying something about calling somebody. He remembered giving Silas's number without quite deciding to. Silas showed up 20 minutes later, still in his shop coveralls, smelling of engine grease, and didn't say a word about the state Rowan was in. He didn't ask what happened. He just stood in the doorway of the stockroom, hands loose at his sides, and let his scent do the talking steady pine. No urgency in it, nothing demanding a response. "You don't have to tell me," he said eventually, "but I'm parked out front, and Tank's in the truck getting impatient. Come sit with the dog a minute." Rowan went. He sat in the passenger seat of Silas's ancient pickup with the block-headed dog's chin resting heavy on his knee, and cried, quietly and without shame, for the better part of 10 minutes while Silas leaned against the driver's door outside, giving him the privacy to fall apart without an audience. When Rowan finally climbed out, red-eyed but steadier, Silas didn't comment on it. He just said, "Boss said take the rest of the day. I already told him you had a family thing." and drove him home. It wasn't a cure. The panic didn't go away for good after that. It came back. Smaller, less often, on nights when the wind sounded a certain way or a stranger's laugh pitched too close to a memory. But every time it did, the same steady scent found its way to him before the worst of it could take hold. And slowly, over months, Rowan's body started believing what his mind already knew, that this house wasn't going to ask anything of him that he didn't offer freely. One Tuesday afternoon in late April, rain came down in sheets. Rowan had the day off. The house quiet except for the smell of wet dog and the stew he'd left simmering in the slow cooker. He walked out to the detached garage, Silas's sanctuary, a cavernous space of engine hoists and tool racks, dominated by the gutted shell of a 1970 Chevelle Silas had been restoring for 3 years. The air smelled of gasoline, oxidized metal, deep pine. Classic rock played low on the radio. Silas was on a creeper, half slid under the car, wrench in a grease-blackened hand. "Brought you coffee," Rowan called over the rain on the tin roof. Silas slid out, wiping his forehead with the back of a forearm and smearing black grease across it in the process. He looked tired. The shop had been slammed all week, and he was taking side jobs just to keep parts money coming in for the Chevelle. "Workbench is fine," he grunted. Sitting up, Rowan crossed the garage, set the thermos down, and didn't immediately leave, leaning back against a metal toolbox instead, arms crossed. "Stew's done," he said. "You haven't eaten since 6 this morning. Transmission pan's not going anywhere. I'll eat when I finish this." It was a small push, a tiny assertion of care that bordered on domestic nagging. 3 months ago, Rowan wouldn't have dreamed of questioning an alpha's schedule. Silas paused, shop towel wrapped around his hands, and looked up. Rowan held the gaze, his own scent steady black tea perfectly level. "You getting bossy on me, kid?" "Just practical," Rowan said. "If you pass out under that car, I can't lift it off you. It's a safety issue." Silas let out a low, rumbling laugh, a rare sound, warm despite the gravel in it, and it sent an unexpected shiver down Rowan's spine. He tossed the towel onto a pile of tires and stood, crossing the narrow space to the workbench for the coffee. As he passed, his shoulder brushed Rowan's, the first real contact between them since the morning Silas had hauled him out of the diner. It lasted less than a second, but it landed like static electricity. Rowan's breath caught. He froze, every omega instinct in his body suddenly, acutely aware of the heat coming off Silas's frame, the sharp scent of sweat and pine underneath the garage smells. Silas stopped too. "I didn't step back." "Sorry," he murmured. His voice dropped an octave. "It's fine," Rowan breathed, heart hammering, not with panic this time, but with something that felt disturbingly like anticipation. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain hammered the tin roof overhead, and the radio hissed through a station break. And Silas's eyes dropped, just once, to Rowan's mouth before he caught himself and looked away, jaw tight, like a man deliberately letting go of a live wire before it could do any damage. "I should get back under the car," he said, voice rougher than it needed to be for the sentence. "Yeah," Rowan agreed, and didn't move either, and neither of them laughed at the contradiction, though it sat there plainly enough between them. Eventually, Silas broke first, picking up the thermos and turning back toward the Chevelle, and Rowan let himself out into the rain, feeling lighter than he had any right to feel, given that nothing technically had happened at all. It became, after that afternoon, an unspoken game neither of them named out loud. A hand lingering half a second too long, passing a plate at dinner. A glance held one beat past comfortable. Neither of them pushed. Neither of them pulled away either. Whatever was building between them built slowly, on its own schedule. The way trust always seemed to in that house, nothing forced, nothing owed. The following Sunday, Silas took him back to the diner under the elevated tracks, the first time Rowan had set foot in it since the night he'd walked in half dead on his feet. Gail was still working the counter, gray roots a little grayer, the same tired eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at the two of them sliding into a booth together, then at the steadier color in Rowan's face, and set down 2 coffees without a word of surprise, like she'd been expecting this exact outcome the whole time. "Look who finally stopped looking like a corpse," she said, sliding a fresh basket of crackers across the table out of pure habit, then swatting Silas's hand away when he reached for one. "Those are for people who've earned them. You've had bacon since 8 this morning. I can smell it on you." "Good to see you too, Bren," Silas said, unbothered, and Rowan laughed, a real easy sound that surprised him a little, coming out of his own mouth. "You did good," Gail told Silas quietly, on her way back to the counter, low enough that she probably thought Rowan couldn't hear it. Didn't think you had it in you. Old man. Neither did I, Silas admitted, and didn't elaborate, and Rowan decided not to make him. May brought its first real warmth, and with it, something Rowan hadn't expected at all. It arrived in the mailbox on a gray Wednesday. A single sheet of notebook paper folded into quarters, tucked inside a plain envelope with no return address. Rowan almost threw it out with the coupons before he recognized the handwriting, small, cramped, uncertain. He'd only seen it once before, on a delivery slip Marcus had once left lying around the apartment, signed by the office temp. Marcus had never once thought to hide well enough. Julian. Rowan sat down at this kitchen table before he opened it, bracing himself for something ugly gloating. Maybe, or a plea for money, or Marcus's words dressed up in someone else's hand. What he found instead was smaller and stranger than anything he'd imagined. I don't know if you'll even read this. I wouldn't blame you if you burned it. I just needed to say I'm sorry. And I don't think I get to say that to anyone else. Because everyone else in this thinks I'm the villain. And maybe I am, but I need you to know something. He doesn't come home most nights. When he does, he complains about how tired he is, how the house isn't run the way he likes it, how I don't cook the way you did. He said your name in his sleep last week. I'm 7 months along and I sleep in a different room because he says my scent keeps him up. I thought I was getting a family. I think I just got what you had. Except I don't have anywhere to walk to. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just thought you deserved to know you didn't lose anything worth having. Rowan read it twice, then a third time, and felt something in his chest that surprised him. Not vindication, not the grim satisfaction he might have predicted for himself 6 months earlier, but something closer to grief for a stranger. He understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly what Marcus was: not a man who'd fallen out of love with one Omega and into it with another, but a man incapable of loving anyone as anything other than a fixture in his own life, arranged for his own comfort. He didn't write back that day, but he folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer of the nightstand in the guest room that had quietly, somewhere along the way, become simply his room. When Silas came home that evening and found him unusually quiet over dinner, Rowan told him everything, start to finish, and watched something grim and unsurprised settle over the mechanic's face. Doesn't change what you did or didn't get from staying, Silas said finally. But it's good, you know. People like that don't get better with a new audience. They just get a new room to do the same thing in. Rowan thought about that for a long time after the dishes were done. It didn't make him hate Marcus more. If anything, it hollowed the anger out and left something cleaner behind it. Relief, mostly, that he'd been the one who'd found a door out before the house collapsed entirely. He thought, too, about how strange it was that the letter hadn't broken him the way he might once have expected. 6 months earlier, news like that would have sent him spiraling for a week. Now it just sat there, sad and true, a fact about someone else's life rather than a verdict on his own. He wrote back a month later, 3 careful lines. Nothing more: that he hoped Julian and the baby were safe, that there was a number for a shelter downtown if he ever needed somewhere to go that wasn't Marcus's, and that none of what had happened between the three of them was Julian's fault to carry alone. He never heard back. He didn't need to. It had never been a conversation he was having for himself. Silas asked him once, weeks later, why he'd bothered writing back at all instead of tearing the letter up and never thinking about the man again. Rowan had turned the question over for a long moment before he found an answer that felt true. Because for a while, I thought I was the only person who ever got to be the one Marcus discarded, he said. Turns out I wasn't special. I was just first. Somebody should tell the next one there's a door, even if he's not ready to walk through it yet. Silas considered that for a moment, turning his coffee mug slowly on the table. You could have just felt sorry for yourself instead. Most people would have. I did that too, Rowan admitted. For about 6 weeks straight, if you remember. I remember. A faint, dry, almost smile. You cried into my good dish towels. I bought you new ones? You did, Silas conceded. Better ones. Actually, Silas hadn't said anything more to that. He just reached over and squeezed the back of Rowan's neck, gentle, careful of the scar, and let the silence do the rest of the talking. It was, Rowan thought later, the first time an alpha's hand on that particular scar had felt like comfort instead of ownership. By late summer, the divorce was final. The thick manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Rowan sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee going cold in front of him and stared at the judge's signature until the letters stopped meaning anything. It was over. The legal tether, cut. The financial one, severed months before. The biological one had shrunk down to nothing but a pale crescent scar on his neck that no longer ached when it rained. He was entirely his own person, $3,000 saved in an account under his own name, a promotion at the hardware store, his own health insurance card in his wallet. He could leave, if he wanted. The thought sat in the center of his mind, clear and absolute, in a way it hadn't been able to for years. The guest room down the hall was still, technically, his. He still paid 100 a week. Silas had never asked for more, never pushed for a change in status, never crossed the line they'd drawn out in the garage months before. They'd built, instead, a strange and steady intimacy cooking together, watching terrible action movies on the battered couch, knees occasionally brushing, operating like a pack of two who'd simply never taken the final, terrifying leap. Rowan slid the decree back into its envelope. The front door opened. Heavy boots echoed down the hall. Tank trotted in, tail wagging lazily, and dropped his heavy head onto Rowan's lap. Rowan scratched behind the dog's ears on autopilot as Silas walked into the kitchen, damp from a run, faded gray shirt stretched over his chest. He took one look at the envelope on the table and froze. The relaxed, domestic air of the room evaporated. He crossed to the fridge instead, pulled out a water bottle, and leaned against the counter, putting distance between them. Papers came through. His voice was carefully neutral. His scent wasn't, pine-spiked, sharp with anxiety underneath it. Yeah. Rowan turned in his chair to face him. Signed and sealed, officially unattached. Silas took a slow drink, looking out at the overgrown backyard, jaw ticking once. That's good? You're clear? A pause. Harder to get through than the first sentence? I saw a for rent sign on the place above the bakery on 4th. Good light, safe block. If you need help with the deposit, I've got the cash. Something sharp bloomed in Rowan's chest, not the ache of a bond breaking, but the ache of a deep, well-meant misunderstanding. Silas was giving him an out. I was overriding every instinct in his own body, the pull to claim, to keep, to hold on to what he cared about just to hand Rowan his freedom back, whole and unclaimed. Because he genuinely believed that was what healing required. Rowan stood, left the envelope where it was, and crossed the kitchen. Silas stayed put at the counter, pale eyes tracking his approach with careful, restrained focus. Rowan stopped less than a foot away. He didn't look at the floor. He didn't bare his throat. Do you want me to move out? Silas, I want you to have a life, Silas said, voice tight. I want you making your own choices. You came here in pieces. You're not in pieces anymore. You don't owe me a thing. I know I don't owe you. Rowan reached out, fingers catching the edge of his shirt. Silas's chest hitched under his knuckles. That's the point. With Marcus. I stayed because biology and money told me I had to. I'm not trapped here, which means if I stay, he took a half step closer, his chest brushing Silas's, the heat of him almost dizzying. It's because I choose it, because I want to be here. Silas's hands, which had been white-knuckled around the edge of the counter, let go. He brought them up instead, framing Rowan's face, calloused and rough and unbelievably gentle. You're sure? His hazel eyes searched Rowan's for any shadow of the ghost they'd both been fighting off for months. I'm not a corporate executive. I don't own a suit. I bring grease into the house. I'm 10 years older than you. You're a genuine idiot. You know that, Rowan said, and it came out soft, breathless, almost a laugh. He leaned his weight forward, trusting the alpha to catch him. And you're exactly where I want to be. Silas didn't ask again. He kissed him, not gentle, not hesitant. A collision, months of restraint finally snapping all at once. His hand slid from Rowan's face down his back, pulling him flush against his chest. Rowan gasped into it, arms coming up around his neck, the world narrowing to pine oil and the deep, grounded musk of a healthy alpha with nothing to prove. There was no claiming bite, no possessive demand in it. It was an offering. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Silas rested his forehead against Rowan's, hands tangled in his hair like he was afraid Rowan might vanish if he let go. Rowan closed his eyes and listened to the steady thud of a heart that had never once asked him for anything he wasn't willing to give. The old bond had been a chain. It had suffocated him, and it had very nearly killed him when it finally snapped. But standing in that kitchen, wrapped up in the arms of a mechanic who'd pulled a stranger out of the cold and never once asked for a reward, Rowan finally understood what a bond was actually supposed to feel like. It wasn't a leash, It was an anchor. And for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged. Tank, who had been watching the entire exchange from his spot on the kitchen rug with the mild interest of a dog who had already decided how this was going to end, finally heaved himself upright, padded over, and shoved his blocky head between their legs, tail thumping hard enough to rattle the cabinet doors. Silas laughed against Rowan's hair, an actual laugh, warm and unguarded. The kind Rowan had only heard from him a handful of times all year, and reached down without breaking the embrace to scratch behind the dog's ears. Guess he's voting yes too, Silas said, low and amused. Guess he is, Rowan agreed, quiet and certain, and let himself stay exactly where he was, wrapped between the two of them, for a long, unhurried time. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice at nothing in particular, and the porch light Silas never remembered to turn off buzzed faintly against the dark. And none of it mattered at all, because for once in his life, Rowan wasn't listening for the sound of a car in the driveway that meant trouble. He was just listening to a heartbeat that had nothing left to prove. Later that night, long after the dishes were done and Tank had claimed his usual spot sprawled across both their feet on the living room rug, Rowan found the divorce decree still sitting on the kitchen table where he'd left it. And for the first time since it had arrived, the sight of it didn't hurt at all. It was just paper. It said nothing about who he was now, only about who he no longer had to be. He carried it down the hall and set it in the drawer of the nightstand, next to Julian's letter. Two endings folded side by side, one that had nearly killed him, one that had let him breathe again. He turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dark of the room that had stopped, somewhere in the months since that first winter night, being a guest room at all, listening to the house settle around him, the tick of the radiator, the dog's heavy sigh from down the hall, the low murmur of Silas moving through his own nighttime routine on the other side of a door that, for once, nobody needed to lock. If Rowan's story stayed with you, don't just scroll past it, tell us in the comments who you were rooting for, Rowan or someone else entirely, and why. Hit like and subscribe so the next story finds its way to you the moment it's out. Thank you for staying with us until the very last word.